of what I looked at to formulate my opinion about whether he was sane at the time of the alleged offense, and the definitions of insanity at the time of the alleged offense, and the duration of mental disease needed for that finding at the time of the alleged offense. That's what I remember.
Did you review a report from a Dr. Baranowski, psychologist?
Yes, that sounds familiar.
From Yale?
Yes.
From Yale. The first time you reviewed that was last Thursday, May 16th. Isn't that correct?
I don't recall specifically.
Well, do you recall meeting with Ms. George to prepare for your testimony on Friday?
Yes.
And do you remember when you were meeting with her, she handed you Dr. Baranowski's report and said, "I don't think you had this before"?
Correct.
All right. So you didn't review it before you had it, right?
Correct.
All right. So the first time, so did you review it after she handed it to you?
I did. I looked through it.
Okay. So some questions about that.
Sure.
Dr. Baranowski did some psychological testing of Mr. Bourgoin back in, look at the date, get it right. We're back in December, January of 2019?
Yes, it was, yes, more than yes, that sounds about right.
And she did this psychological testing and found that Mr. Bourgoin, the testing showed that he had a personality profile consistent with borderline personality disorder. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And that testing, that type of psychological testing is what is found through that psychological testing may be a personality disorder that's enduring over time, correct?
That is borderline personality disorder, yeah.
Correct, that is enduring over time.
Correct. Long-standing maladaptive traits is the term that's used in the diagnostic nomenclature.
Okay. And do you have any quarrel with any of the findings of Dr. Baranowski?
Finding that he had borderline personality disorder?
Correct, that the testing was consistent with him having borderline personality disorder, correct?
I have questions about a person with his capacity to function and his ability to adjust in a variety of situations through childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, and into the relationship, into two relationships, the first with his first girlfriend and the second with Vanilla, and his ability to recover and his work skills and so forth and his efforts to move forward in his life. I have questions about that diagnosis in a person with his history.
Okay. But do you have any quarrels with the fact that that's what her finding through her testing showed?
Yes, she
okay.
did a test, and that's what she found in the date on the date she tested, or
okay.
he tested the person.
And she also states a person with borderline personality disorder can become psychotic in the presence of emotional discontrol. Do you agree with that?
It's possible. Yes, I agree that that's certainly possible.
Okay. And the person could also become rageful and disinhibited. Kind of, they could go either way.
If they have borderline personality disorder, it's possible that they could go either way.
Okay, but if there's a more, she's saying that there's a susceptibility there. Is that what, do you agree with that?
With the general point that there's a susceptibility in persons with borderline personality disorder to have deteriorated conditions at some point.
Okay.
Yes, that's part of the definition of the unstable person with borderline personality disorder.
So there's nothing in, again, in your report or in your deposition where you gave an opinion as to why that Mr. Bourgoin was suicidal, correct? Nothing in either of your reports or your deposition, correct? Mm-hmm. Is that a yes?
Sorry. Yes, sorry.
And nothing that he was in a rage, correct?
I'd have to go look, but I think I pointed out to his anger and frustration.
Okay. But you never said he was in a rage?
I may have not. If you're telling me I never used the word rage, I will accept that as...
And in your report or deposition, you never offered any explanation whatsoever about why Stephen Bourgoin was going the wrong way on the highway that night.
You mean when he left his house and drove up the highway?
Yeah.
Or in the coming back with the
No,
trooper's car?
The first time, the first crash.
The first time.
You've never offered an opinion, either in your report or in your deposition or in your testimony last Friday, as to why Mr. Bourgoin did that.
I did not offer an opinion about that.
You are aware that Mr. Bourgoin had a concern about being the legal parent of his daughter, correct? You remember that discussion with him about him having a concern about they're unmarried, he has a daughter, and it was difficult for him that he wasn't considered his daughter legally because him and Anila weren't married. Do you remember that discussion?
I don't specifically, but it sounds accurate because he did, that was something we discussed.
Okay. And you're aware that actually in September of 2016, he was able to get that. He was able to get the court to formally order that he was the parent of the child.
I accept that because the court subsequently then gave him permission to go to to see her.
At the gymnastics.
At the gymnastics.
Right.
Yeah. I don't remember specifically that issue with the court, but it sounds accurate.
And you're aware that there was a period of time after the May domestic assault and prior to the court hearing in September where he wasn't able to see his daughter at all, correct?
Yes, that was a period
And then
of frustration and sadness for him.
And then he was granted the 1 hour a week on Saturdays at the gymnastics class. You're aware of that?
I was aware that he was granted a 1 hour at the gymnastics class. I don't recall whether that was an enduring finding order by the judge, but I remember he went to the gymnastics class.
So you remember he went to one gymnastics class?
I do, and I remember his talking about that.
Do you remember when the next visit was going to be with Mr. Bourgoin with his daughter?
I don't.
Okay. That doesn't have any significance or relationship to your opinion in this case, when the next visit Mr. Bourgoin was going to have with his daughter?
When Mr. Bourgoin was going to have the next visit with his daughter, or the first visit with his daughter, given the question you just asked me about how long was it before he was able to go and get the judge to give him permission to go to the class, would not affect my opinion about his mental state at the time of the offense, given the definition of mental disease.
When Mr. Bourgoin was given the judge gave Mr. Bourgoin some visitation in the hearing in September. Are you aware that the judge said, hey, we'll come back in 60 days and review this?
I have no reason to doubt that that's the case. I don't recall specifically what the judge said in terms of follow-up.
Okay. You talked on direct about reviewing a statement by Asima Kosovic prior to rendering your opinion and final report in this case. Do you remember that testimony?
Yes.
Okay. You hadn't reviewed anything from Asima Kosovic prior to issuing your final report, correct? I remember
remember the material from Alan Kosovic. I remember that Asima and Alan and he went out to dinner. I don't recall exactly when she made the statements that she did. Perhaps I misspoke when I said that I reviewed it prior to doing the examination.
Okay. So whether you reviewed it before the report or after, you have now reviewed statements by Asima Kosovic, correct?
Yes, I do recall some of the things that you said.
You knew her to be Mr. Bourgoin's best friend?
She was a very good friend.
And you considered her statements and her opinion about things in analyzing your opinion, even if you had already given it, but in analyzing your opinion, correct? I'll withdraw, that's a bad question. You remember that Ms. Kosovic said that Mr. Bourgoin was acting really weird the week before the crash.
It's certainly accurate based upon what I reviewed from Lake Champlain Chocolates.
Okay. That the people at Lake Champlain Chocolates thought he was acting really weird as well, correct? Yes?
He was, yes. Look at the dialogue between him and Alan, during that week about what he was going to do and how he's going to do it, how he's going to pay for things, etc. The whole list of worries that he had were significant.
The question was, Ms. Kosovic said he was acting weird. You remember her saying that? Not that he was talking about finances or talking about other things, that he was acting weird.
She may have said that.
You don't remember?
I grant you that she said he's acting weird. I have no reason to doubt that she said that common statement.
Okay. And that she had started noticing those changes on the Saturday, Sunday before the accident. Right? The week before.
I would grant you that she said that. I don't recall.
And
I wouldn't be at all surprised, given what he was going through, that he was acting weird.
okay. And that she had dinner with her and her husband and Mr. Bourgoin on Thursday, October 6th at Al's French Fries.
Correct.
Okay. And that he was, quote, not himself at that dinner.
I have no doubt that she said that.
Okay. That he was very spacey when talking to them.
Yes.
And that while he was usually a neat freak and a nice dresser, at dinner he was just in sweatpants. Remember her saying that?
I have no doubt that she said that.
That he was just kind of wandering around, looking around, and then he turned to her and kind of looked at me and threw me at the same time. Remember her saying that?
No, but I don't. It certainly sounds familiar enough with what she's said and how she expressed concern about her friend.
Right. And that she thought something was wrong.
Yes, there was a lot that was wrong.
That he was acting confused and sad and different.
Correct.
And that he was engaging in conversation, that he was not engaging in conversation like he normally would.
Yes. When was that statement? Just help me in terms of thinking about this.
In a statement, she made a statement on October 18th, 2016 to Detective Katz.
October, I see, okay.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, no.
And she's talking about, the last thing we were talking about was what she was saying occurred at the dinner at Al's French Fries on Thursday the 6th with her and her husband.
Yes.
That in particular, she remembered one conversation about bullying, and Stephen's responses didn't make sense. Remember her saying that?
That I don't remember.
And then it's the Friday night into Saturday morning that he stops by, Mr. Bourgoin stops by the house at 4 o'clock in the morning or so.
Yes, that Alan,
And Asima said he had never done that before.
correct,
And that was odd for him to do.
yes. To stop by somebody's house at 4 o'clock in the morning out of
And then
stress and distress is odd.
Right. And then he left saying well, they offered for him to stay with them, correct?
Correct.
But then he left, he said, I'm going to see Izzy in the morning, I want to get some rest. Remember him saying that?
I don't doubt it. I don't recall specifically all the back and forth of that dialogue.
And that he had asked for Anila when he came to their house. You remember that?
No, as I say, I don't remember the dialogue specifically at this point, but if it's in the material, I have no doubt.
That she said it was odd that he would do that because there would be no reason for Anila to be there. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that, but certainly sounds like it could have happened, and he was in a very compromised, worried state.
And do you remember that Ms. Kosovic, Asima Kosovic, also made a statement, also told the police, and in a deposition also talked about a statement of Mr. Bourgoin getting upset and doing things if somebody were to take his daughter away. Do you remember that?
That had been consistent through the fall. Yes, certainly I'm not surprised that she said that. He was extremely distressed about the actions of the court, the actions of the police, about his daughter and Anila's second charge against him.
But do you remember that he made a statement about doing harm to anybody in connection with people losing custody of his daughter?
To Asima?
No, to others, just to others. Do you ever did Asima talk about Mr. Bourgoin making a statement about harming others if in fact he were to lose custody of his daughter?
I don't recall that specifically, but certainly it's a common enough statement that people make when they're upset and
Right.
don't want people to interfere with their relationship with their children.
Right.
With domestic assault cases, this is common.
And do you remember Asima Kosovic saying that he did make a comment like that, but it was just in passing,
I don't recall that.
and that she didn't take him seriously?
I don't recall that.
And
But
she was laughing, they were laughing by the end of the conversation? Do you remember her saying that?
No, I don't recall her saying that specifically, but I wouldn't doubt it at all. I just don't have that kind of memory for the dialogue, but I would accept it, that he was upset, and then by the end of the conversation, he was laughing with her. You know, if that's what you're saying.
I can just have a moment, Judge.
Sure.
Show you marked as double X, defendant's double X for identification. Identify what that is.
This says deposition of
Oh, it says-
Asima Kosovic, as recorded on December 21st.
If you could look at page 37, maybe go back to 36, read that to yourself, see if that refreshes your recollection about reading about what Ms. Kosovic had to say about these statements made by Mr. Bourgoin. remember that now?
No, but I read it.
Read it, okay.
So
And that she didn't, in general, she just didn't take them seriously, and it was something made in passing, and they were laughing by the time it was all over.
Yes.
And again, you've just testified that's a statement people make, right?
They can, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Not people, I would say some people.
Some people.
Some people who have domestic assault charges make statements, and they're limited in their contact with family members, make statements like that.
You talked about Lake Champlain folks, reviewing information about Lake Champlain folks, talking about Mr. Bourgoin's behavior the week before the accident, the crash. Do you remember? Do you remember
Correct.
that? Okay. Do you remember specifically reading about what Chrissy Gleason had to say about Mr. Bourgoin?
I can't identify the people. I can remember some of the details of their descriptions of Mr. Bourgoin, but I don't remember the names of the individuals.
Don't remember Chrissy Gleason as his best friend at work?
Not at this point, no.
And that week he looked exhausted, frazzled, and she needed to check in with him to see how he was doing.
I would have, that was the week that despite his performance and ability to talk with other people at Lake Champlain Chocolates about a variety of his different capacities and his interaction with them about the work and the work product that he was able to put forward. Despite that, they noted that he was, he was dejected and not in good shape.
You remember a woman named Dodie that worked there speaking as well?
No, I don't recall. I read those, but I don't recall the specific.
You don't remember her saying that he made a lot of mistakes at work, particularly when it came to picking orders?
She may well have said that.
And that Mr. Fabian said that week he started parking away from everyone?
Yes, that I do remember.
That a week before the crash, she noticed different behavior by Mr. Bourgoin, and saw him talking on his phone and pacing back and forth.
I have no doubt about that. I know there was description of both his productivity and his difficulties at Lake Champlain Chocolate.
And that she said he was acting really strange. Do you remember Ms. Fabian saying that?
I don't recall that, but I have no doubt that she said it. And that's what was in the deposition, in the transcript.
That he was lingering outside her office with his head down. Remember that?
No.
And that you remember on Friday the 7th that he drove erratically back into the parking lot after lunch? Do you remember that?
That I do recall, yes. He was increasingly distressed.
In the just have a moment, Your Honor. On the stand, I just want to be clear about this. On the stand on Friday, you said that you reviewed, I wrote this down, you reviewed the records for Mr. Bourgoin's records from visiting the morning of the crash. Well, the question was, did you view the records from the morning of the crash? Did you see any evidence that he was in a manic state, was the question Ms. George asked you. And you answered, no evidence that he came in later in the day when he was evaluated by Dr. Steingart. Dr. Steingart didn't evaluate him the morning of the crash, correct?
Correct.
Dr. Steingart is the court screener person on the 14th prior to the arraignment, correct?
Yes, after he was arrested.
Okay. And Dr. Steingart's review of him was basically that it was difficult to determine given the limited nature of the interview. He didn't open his eyes. He did not volunteer any information. Remember that's what he did with Dr. Steingart?
Correct.
Right. And that At some point, she just asked him, do you want to be in a psychiatric hospital? And he shook his head no.
Correct.
Now, you said to diagnose somebody with a mental disease, you need to be able to look at their history, correct?
It's one of the things, yes.
I mean, I think you said on direct, it can't just be something that happens for an hour. You got to kind of look at the person's history and see whether these things are something that just happening in an isolated, or is it something that you see over time, correct?
The issue of mental disease or defect for the purpose of not being able to appreciate the wrongfulness of what you're doing, or to conform your conduct to the requirements of the law, in my opinion, requires a diagnosis of mental disease, and the diagnoses of mental disease have, as a part of their component parts, they talk about the duration of symptoms that you need to observe to be present in order to make the diagnosis. So that is standard, and that's what I was referring to.
And so at the time of your final report, the only history you had about Mr. Bourgoin was the history he provided to you.
In the police reports.
The police reports were about the crime, correct?
Correct.
Right. And there were some limited witness statements from individuals that knew Mr. Bourgoin, correct?
Correct.
But they didn't provide a years worth of history of Mr. Bourgoin and his moods and his potential depressions and things like that, correct?
No, but he did, at quite great length and with attention to very specific detail.
Okay. And he's not a psychiatrist, right?
No, he is the patient.
Do people sometimes describe things, and they describe things to you, and they're not even aware of the fact that they were depressed for a month or two? In a medical sense?
There are some times that can happen, but in a 4-hour examination, when you sit with a person and have the opportunity to review the details of their life experience, and you are able to you're able to listen to the person's description of their progress over time, his progress over time, his move to different work in other places, interactions with other people, achievements and failures, you get a sense of the detail that gives you a longitudinal picture as opposed to an individual point in time.
You were eventually able to review a lengthy interview that Ms. Kiley did with Anila Lawrence, correct?
I believe I did. Yes, Ms. Kiley did do some interviews. I recall those.
She did an interview with Ms. Lawrence, which basically went through her entire history with Mr. Bourgoin. Do you remember reading that?
I'm sure I did. I can't specifically say what was in that history with that was taken.
That was some of the material that was sent to you by the state's attorney's office when you were re-engaged to work on the case, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But you didn't review it till after your deposition in the case, correct?
That I did not have a chance to review Ms. Kiley's material before the deposition, because I remember you were asking me that question, right, and I said I hadn't gotten to it yet, but I have subsequently.
Okay. And in that, so you've reviewed it now?
Yes.
And in that interview, Ms. Lawrence talks about Mr. Bourgoin having severe mood swings, correct?
Yes.
And having periods of time where he lied in bed and didn't get out of bed for periods of time, for it's for weeks on end?
I don't recall weeks on end, but I do recall that she did describe that he had a series of difficulties.
And that, she was noticing things that made her think that he was bipolar?
She said that in the deposition.
I'm asking you. Do you remember her saying that?
I certainly don't recall that. I do recall that she was explicit and detailed about their history and about his assaulting her in Massachusetts, the charge, what he then did subsequent to that, the difficulties he had with work because of that charge, how he did repair the relationship, and so forth. I remember her describing, how you reunite with somebody who has been charged with domestic assault against you, and her going through that experience and why she did it and so forth.
Do you remember her talking about him having a complete breakdown over their planned wedding?
Yes, I do remember that because there were invitations that were sent and it didn't go forward.
And you talk about Mr. Bourgoin having these different jobs. I mean, Mr. Bourgoin's intelligent guy?
Yes.
Did it seem to you that he wasn't getting jobs that were commensurate with his intelligence?
My experience in talking with many people over many, many years is that people make job choices for all kinds of different reasons. He was very disappointed that he couldn't go to college. He was very pleased with the job at Logic Supply and described how pleased he was with that job. He was extremely distressed that he had committed domestic assault, which he found out when subsequently, and I think he was in Florida when he found this out, he found out that when you've done something like that and you go to court in Massachusetts, even though the case is dismissed, and even though there's no finding, it can be Googled, and because of the fact that he had this domestic assault charge against him in the report, this was an external decision on the part of employers not to consider people who've had such charges, and therefore he was upset, understandably upset and disappointed that he could not get the kind of job that he really wished to have and the kind that he did so well in at Logic Supply. That's what I recall.
That's what he told you?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that his mental mental abilities, his mental condition, and mental disease might have contributed to any of his problems keeping a good job?
Well, I don't know the circumstances of his, I can't tell you the specific conditions of his leaving, not being able to get another job. But what I can say is that his colleagues told me at Champlain Chocolates, in the time just before this event, he was able to sit, he had a mental capacity. He could sit and talk with colleagues and help them to make shipping orders of chocolates from the West Coast to Vermont in ways that saved Lake Champlain Chocolate money. He talked about the size of the boxes that needed to be utilized in order for them to make these deliveries, how much refrigeration you need, and so forth. Mr. Bourgoin had mental capacity to deal with things, and the fact that he had a domestic assault charge back in Newburyport that constrained other people from hiring him to something in which he could have earned more money and it could have been a better job than he had at Heritage Toyota or Lake Champlain Chocolate, is yes, I'm sure it was disappointing and distressing to him.
So a big part of this case is about whether or not Mr. Bourgoin knew he was going the wrong way on the highway prior to the first crash, correct?
A big part, the part that I was asked to consider was, did he have mental disease or defect that impaired his capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his act or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law? That is the question that I was asked.
Okay. But part of that is whether or not he knew he was going the wrong way on the highway, right?
I answered the question.
The state asked you to tell the jury on Friday what Mr. Bourgoin said about the accident. Do you remember that?
I don't, but...
Well, you answered vague, you didn't tell me much. You remember that?
I could, that sounds correct.
Okay. But he told you, I remember trying to avoid a car that came in front of me, and then there was an impact.
Yes, he talked about the impact.
Okay. And he said, I couldn't tell that I was going the wrong way. You remember him telling you that?
Yes, that certainly could be true.
Just that there were cars coming like this, and you have in parentheses in your report opposite, and we're on the same street. Do you remember that he told you that?
Yes, that sounds correct.
I don't have anything else, Judge. Thank you.
Redirect.
Good afternoon, Dr. Cotton. Just have a couple of questions for you. Mr. Kadams asked you on cross whether or not you attempted to or considered doing another examination of Mr. Bourgoin in 2019. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
And you responded that you didn't.
That is correct.
So can you tell the jury why you didn't feel that that was important?
The question that I was asked was his mental state at the time of this offense. And one of the things that I attend to is the history up until the time of the offense. That the details of his personal and medical and mental and work history is the thing that is relevant to my making that determination. So to make a determination, and I made a determination, and to make a determination in a person with the history that was given to me, the materials that I had, I felt I made a determination with reasonable medical certainty. I subsequently had the opportunity to see the Department of Corrections and the UVM medical records subsequent to this. And I wouldn't have done it but those records showed me that in the period of time before I did my examination and subsequent, before I did my examination but subsequent to the accident, there was no data that supports the diagnosis of, in my opinion, the diagnosis of mental disease, nor was there any treatment in the 1,000 or so pages of the Department of Corrections medical records that he was seen, where, although he was seen frequently, that he had any signs or symptoms of mental disease. So if somebody said to me, will you re-examine him now, years later, I would have said, I had the data available to me at the time I did the examination from prior to that first examination. And subsequently, in getting additional data, both from UVM and DOC, I did not see anything that would have raised a question about my decision-making and diagnosis and my finding, and therefore I certainly would not have done another examination even further into the future.
Okay. And so if Mr. Bourgoin was incarcerated officially on October 20th and you met with him on December 1st, it's that in-between period that you felt was important for you to review, but having done your evaluation less than 8 weeks after the crashes, you didn't feel that an examination 2.5 years later was necessary?
That is correct.
And in fact would not have helped, in your opinion, at all?
Correct.
And at the time that you examined Mr. Bourgoin in 2016, you had the information that the court provided. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you make your opinion in 2016 based on the information that you were provided and the 4-hour examination that you did with Mr. Bourgoin?
I did.
And are you often making your decisions regarding competency or sanity with that amount of information?
Yes.
And in fact, you do these same sanity and competency evaluations multiple times a week, right?
That is correct.
And
some weeks at least.
yeah. And to date, sitting here today, with all of the information that you did review, have you seen any evidence or data or documents that would tend to negate your opinion regarding Mr. Bourgoin's sanity?
I have not.
Have you seen evidence or data or documents that tended to support your finding that he was sane at the time?
Subsequent to my report?
Yes.
Yes.
And did you find the medical records from UVM Medical Center to have been supportive of your ultimate finding?
Yes.
And have you since reviewed the depositions of the UVM Medical Center staff who interacted with Mr. Bourgoin the morning of the crash?
I have reviewed both.
Did you feel that those also supported your decision, your opinion?
They supported my decision, and also they supported my frequent observation in terms of multiple people that I see in the emergency room, how they do their business, and whether they were operating with professional standards in terms of the ER protocols, and when you examine people who come in with the kinds of questions that Mr. Bourgoin had. And
did you also review the depositions, and I believe you may have been present for the actual trial testimony of Dr. Knackle, Dr. Kennedy, and Dr. Runyon?
Yes.
And did their testimony support your finding?
Their testimony did support my findings.
And are you familiar with Dr. Runyon and Dr. Kennedy, the psychiatrists at UVM Medical Center?
Yes.
Do you trust that they would have been able to see signs of mania or psychosis when they interacted with him?
I trust that they would be able to see signs of mania or psychosis when they interacted with them.
Okay. And as to Dr. Baranowski's findings, is it your understanding that those findings are based on the testing that she did when she did the testing in 2019?
Yes.
Okay. And you were asked a lot of questions about his behavior in the week prior to the crashes and Mr. Bourgoin potentially acting strange or weird, and that didn't seem to surprise you. Why did that not surprise you?
Because he was under a great deal of stress in a variety of ways. He had the experience with the limited contact he had with his beloved daughter, and was thinking about that and was distressed about the restrictions that were placed in even that limited contact, And it was, to say that it was unsatisfying to him is certainly understandable given what the court ordered and how it ordered something that the court considered to be the right way to do things given for the child and the family's safety.
And does the fact that he in fact followed those orders by the court, does that play any part in your opinion today?
Yes, that he was able to push forward with recovery in a variety of ways over a long period of time. And even with this assault, as he had with previous difficulties he had had, he, as he did when he returned from Florida, after leaving after the first assault, he moved forward, found work, tried to reestablish himself, tried to reestablish his relationship with Anila, was excited about the baby, was excited even about his marriage, even though it didn't, the details of the wedding didn't go forward in the way they had initially planned.
Okay. And after your initial review, your examination of Mr. Bourgoin, your subsequent review of all of the information you were given, direct examination in trial, cross-examination in this trial, has your opinion changed regarding Mr. Bourgoin's sanity at the time of these offenses?
It has not changed.
What is your opinion?
My opinion is that Mr. Bourgoin would not be considered insane at the time of these offenses.
And can you tell us one more time why you believe that?
Because I did not find data to support the presence of mental disease or defect that would have impaired his capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
Thank you.
Just briefly, Judge. So you reviewed different opinion about that from Dr. Rosemarin and Dr. Kapoor, correct?
That is correct.
And you had reviewed, with Dr. Kapoor, you had reviewed her 2 depositions prior to my deposition of you back in March, correct?
I don't recall with certainty when I looked at them, but I'm not, if I said that I had reviewed them, then I had reviewed them.
So there was a deposition, again, we talked about it, there was a deposition that I did of Dr. Kapoor down in Connecticut.
Yes, it was the hot room, yes.
The hot room.
Yes, now I
Where
remember.
we didn't have, she didn't write a report, but I went through and I made her, asked her to lay out her opinion with regard to the case.
Yes.
During that,
Yes, I remember that.
interview or deposition. And so then in March, when I went to depose you, I asked you what your opinion was about Dr. Kapoor's opinion. And you said, I don't have any opinion about Dr. Kapoor. Do you remember that?
Did I say that? I don't remember that.
You may be hiding it on me, Dr.
But
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. I'm not surprised.
After we look at Defendant's Exhibit W, If you look at first you could look at page 43.
Page 43. Yes, I am on page 43.
Okay, if you just look at that page, read it to yourself. See if you say you have no opinion about Dr. Kapoor.
Well, yes, what I said was that that it was my impression that Dr. Kapoor did not complete a formal report to the court.
Right, I know you said that, but then I asked you, and then you ended that conversation with saying, I have no opinion about Dr. Kapoor.
Well, if no, right, so the question is again, can you offer an opinion as to Dr. Kapoor's opinion? And I say not with the data that I was supplied with. As you pointed out, as you point out, it was a limited amount of data.
You had a full deposition of her laying out her opinion and her rationale for her opinion, correct?
I had what was supplied, yes.
And if you look at page 75, I asked you whether you had an opinion about her diagnosis of unspecified personality disorder. And do you remember saying, I don't have an opinion about that?
I well might have said that based upon the information that I have. No doubt about that was her opinion.
But you expressed no opinion about her opinion at the deposition in March.
I guess that is correct.
You all set?
Yes.
You can step back, Doctor. Thank you. Any further witnesses for this statement?
No, Your Honor.
So, rebuttal is done. Any further witnesses for Sir rebuttal?
Yes, Judge. To begin with, we have, I believe, a stipulation as to the admission of Defendant's Exhibit 3, and, I'm sorry, JJ and KK, which are screenshots from Cy Ray's presentation.
Okay, so these are screenshots taken from his visual presentation.
Correct.
By agreement of the parties, JJ and KK are admitted.
That's correct, Judge.
So JJ and KK are admitted without objection.
That's what we call Lorenzo Whitcomb.
Solemnly affirm the evidence you shall gather relative to the cause now under consideration shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth, means and penalties of perjury. Please be seated. You're going to have to speak up. Speak into the microphone.
Good afternoon. State your name for the record.
Lorenzo Whitcomb,
Okay, and where do you live?
Williston.
Are you employed?
I am.
What do you do for work?
I'm a dairy farmer.
All right. Where's your farm?
It's in Williston and Essex Junction.
And do you know Stephen Bourgoin?
No, I do not.
Did there come a point in time where somebody approached you with some connection to the Stephen Bourgoin matter?
Yes.
When was that?
Friday.
And had you spoken with anybody prior to that about the Stephen Bourgoin matter?
No.
And did you ever have any connection with an outfit named Casella Organics?
Yes.
Okay, when did you have some connection to them?
We've been working with Casella Organics from roughly 2001 till last year.
Okay. And when you were working with them, what were you doing? Who's Casella Organics?
Casella Organics had a contract to utilize biosolids from the local wastewater treatment plant that was used in our farm.
And were you working with them back in the fall of 2016?
Yes, we were.
And so they would spread things on what would they do specifically on your farm?
Basically, they were doing soil tests and water tests, part of the state's permit for applying biosolids on the land. I was actually applying biosolids.
And when you applied the biosolids, did you have to do any type of posting or anything like that?
Yeah, as part of the permit, the land is supposed to be posted, with basically stating that the biosolids are being used for fertilization on that field.
Okay. Showing you what's been marked as defendants double Z, and ask you if you recognize what this is.
Yeah, that's very similar to the posting that we put on at the entrance of the field.
Okay, is that actually one of the posters that you put up?
Yes.
Okay, and on that poster, it does it have a date on it?
Yes.
What's the date that's on there?
It was originally 2016, and I had taken a magic marker and changed it to 2018.
Okay, so you didn't have to print out a new poster?
Right, we had some left over.
And you posted this poster on the, where did you post this poster?
Basically, on that particular field, it was 2 entrances. Put them on a grate stake near the entrance of the field.
No, I would move for the admission of defendants double Z.
Any objection?
No objection.
Double Z is admitted without objection.
Was there a 800 phone number for Casella Organics on that poster?
Yes, there is.
So, show you what's been marked as defendants JJ for identification, and ask you if you recognize what this is.
Yeah, it's a photo of our, well, part of the field is in this photo.
So that's an aerial photograph of the area around your farm?
Yes.
Is all of your farm in there?
No, it's not.
So where is your farm in the photograph? Just, is it bottom, top?
Yeah, top.
The top. And if this is a north-south, if it's aligned correctly directionally, what side of the river is your farm?
Maybe on the north side.
And there's a kind of a red markings on here. Is your farm up here where the arc kind of meets the line?
It goes right through a field that we own. So, yeah.
So, do you just have a dairy farm, or do you do you grow things on the farm as well?
We grow basically corn and alfalfa and soybeans for the dairy herd.
I'm going to show you one more. AAA.
Your Honor, may we approach?
Please be seated.
So just to take a step back, was there just this one sign that was up on your farm?
No, there were multiple signs.
Okay. And where would the signs, do you post them in the middle of the field, or where would you put the signs?
Generally in the entrance of a field.
So I'm going to show you now what's been marked as defendant's AAA, and it's, is it the same photograph that's in the other exhibit that I just gave you?
Yes. Yeah, it appears to be the same.
And if you could just maybe put an X on places approximately where some of these signs were back in October of 2016. Any other questions? Thank you.
You cross.
Good afternoon, Mr. Whitcomb. You told the ladies and gentlemen that you've never met Mr. Bourgoin.
No,
So you've never seen him in your fields or anywhere near your property, is that correct?
that's correct.
Okay, and nobody ever reported to you seeing him in your fields at any point in October of 2016?
No,
Okay. You don't even know if he's even been on your property at all, do you?
I had
Okay.
no first knowledge.
And these signs, they're 8x10 signs?
Yes.
You have no personal knowledge that Mr. Bourgoin actually saw any of these signs on your property?
No,
And you have no knowledge of whether, if he even saw the signs, he used them in any particular way?
no,
Casella Organics, is Casella engaged in any other kind of business?
the rubbish removal business.
Okay. Thank you.
Any further
Nothing
questions?
else, Judge, thank you.
Thank you. You can step down. Okay, any further witnesses?
No, Judge.
Okay, so the evidence is closed, I think. We're closing the evidence?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. All right, so it's my understanding, since we've reached the point of closing arguments, that the parties may need a little bit of time to set up for the closing arguments. So it's also a perfect time for your afternoon break. So we're almost going to have this case. So just have a great break. Please, again, avoid any conversation about the case. Then let me talk to the parties for a second on the side after we excuse the jury. Thank you.
All rise, please.